everyone. Good evening. I guess, I don't know if some of you follow current events, but there's a lot going on. Does anybody know what the Borscht Belt is? Have any of you heard of that? Few people. Okay, so my favorite Borscht Belt joke is this one. A waiter goes up to a table full of old ladies and he says, "Ladies, is anything okay?" So our distinguished, well, this is going to be a teach-in, right? So I'm very happy. This is a co-sponsored event between the Center for Congressional, Congress Does Exist, and Presidential Studies, and Ron Elving and Chris Edelson are both affiliated with the center, and the project on Civic Dialogue, which Lara Schwartz, and the founding director. So we've got these great subject matter experts here on constitutional crisis. This is also meant to be a teach-in. We want this to be a conversation where we learn what you want to know, what you need to know, and you kind of think about what you want to know. And so there's going to be time for that. So I'm encouraging you to, get your questions onto your Post-its if you have them. I know someone from PCD will come and grab those so we can engage with those questions, and we have a mic to pass. I'm going to take a second. Ron and Chris, can you say something so that we can just see that the people, whether the people in the back can hear you?
Can people hear okay? I might stand up though. Testing? All right. Can you hear in the back? Good. Okay. All right. That's a good room. All right.
Okay, so today we're gonna be talking about gestures around to all of the things. We've got, I think it was a no-brainer who to ask. So Chris Edelson has written a couple of books on executive power, and they keep getting slightly out of date, even though they're quite good, because executives keep on doing.
There's a new one coming.
There's a new one coming. What?
I just sent it to Kansas, the University of Kansas, so hopefully
go Jayhawks.
Let's see.
Okay. Right. So lots for you to read. And Ron Elving, you've probably pulled over and stayed in your car to hear the rest of what he's saying about Congress, about the media, about the polity, about this town, about this country, right? So these are the two people that I think we can trust best to help us learn our way through this. Just for people who aren't familiar with our approach to the project on Civic Dialogue, the idea is that we try and frame good questions, right? So we're not going to do is Trump bad? Is life bad? We're going to try and hopefully come out of here with a better understanding of what's going on. And how do you know if you're in a constitutional crisis? How do you know if it's gotten bad? So I want to start with Chris, our presidential and executive power expert, and ask you, there's all kinds of executive power. There's a lot of it. And it's been, as you've written over the years, they keep using more and more of it, right? How do you know when you're in some kind of a crisis? And this is one of the questions already on the board.
Yes.
What's distinctive about this moment?
I think I'll stand up just to try to make eye contact with people there. First, thanks to Professor Schwartz for organizing this. And also, it's been hard for me to laugh for a while, and to have the ability to bring that out is impressive. It's necessary to do, so I appreciate that too. So the American Bar Association put out a statement a few days ago, and it said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but I think pretty closely, they said, when there's an election, there's change, and people expect that, but they expect change within the rule of law. I see some people here in a class I teach right now, and I've been talking about this in class recently. Sometimes presidents are faced with emergency, like Lincoln when he came in. The Civil War was starting when he took office. Roosevelt when he came in, the Great Depression, the economic system was on the brink of failure. They took extraordinary actions. Lincoln took unilateral actions. With Congress out of session, he asked Congress to approve. Roosevelt declared an emergency for a bank holiday. Those are the exceptions, though. When there's not an extraordinary emergency like that, normally what happens is presidents will act with Congress. When Biden came into office, there was a lot of legislation he wanted to get passed. Some of it did, some of it didn't. You probably remember from following that a lot of the focus was on the Democrats controlled both chambers, but there were 2 votes in the Senate that were really uncertain. And of course, in the Senate, there's always the question of overcoming filibuster. The same was true when President George W. Bush took office in his second term. He wanted to make changes to Social Security, tried to do that through the legislature. Obama was getting healthcare passed. Clinton tried to get healthcare passed and had an economic package. That's what ordinarily happens. Presidents will take action mostly with Congress. What's different about what's happening now is so much of what's happening is unilateral. Unilateral doesn't always mean wrong. It doesn't always mean bad. Presidents can issue executive orders, but they need to be supported by law, by the Constitution or by statute. Much of what is happening right now is not. Much of what's, there's one professor, David Super, he's a professor at Georgetown, who said, I'm paraphrasing, but I think this is pretty close to, he said, so much of what's happening is illegal. And I'll stop in a second because I don't want to talk too much at the beginning. I can get into the details. And Professor Super said, essentially, it looks like they're just trying to do so much that's illegal that it overwhelms the system. It's not going to stop. So that's what's different about right now is we're not faced with the kind of emergency that Lincoln or Roosevelt faced, fortunately. That might demand some unilateral action or unusual unilateral action. But what we're seeing is unilateral action on a scale that actually is much more, most of what Roosevelt did during the famous first 100 days was legislation. Lincoln took some unilateral action, but when he called Congress back into session, he got it approved. The Trump administration and Elon Musk as well, who's in this really sort of unclear, uncertain position, are doing things unilaterally on their own. That's what's most distinct to me about this. Let me stop there for now.
Thanks, Chris. And
yeah.
Somebody had to kick off the ball, and I'm glad it was you. Let me just say, I guess I'm representing to some degree the congressional side of this, and none of this would be happening except that Congress has allowed it to happen. And I don't mean just this Congress in the last few weeks. I mean Congress over a long period of time. Now, there was an era when Congress was not supine. Once upon a time, there was a president named Richard Nixon. And when he won a second term, like Trump did, he won what you would really call a mandate, not Elon Musk's definition of a mandate, which is apparently 49.6%, but a 60% mandate in 49 states, 49 out of 50 states. That resounded. That was a mandate. So he came into office for his second term, 1973, and his domestic policy advisor, a guy named John Ehrlichman. That would really date you if you nodded at that one. John Ehrlichman said, you know what? Congress just does way too much spending. And we're afraid that we're not going to be able to tell them not to. So we're just going to put a limit on it ourselves. We're the executive branch. We just won 60% of the vote. Everybody knows Congress spends too much money. Everybody knows the deficit is too big. I won't even tell you how big it was at the time. And so we're just going to impound some of that money. I didn't necessarily use that word right away, but that's what it amounted to. And the president had a recognized power of impoundment going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. And it had been used very sparingly and very carefully, and usually in negotiation with Congress, so that nobody really got their nose out of joint about it. And again, very small amounts of money in very limited situations. Nixon decided it's time to start impounding by the billions and the tens of billions and really get a handle on this budget thing and exert executive control over the budget. So Congress pushed back, was under Democratic control, at least nominally at the time, but they were offended by this loss of power. And so they passed a couple of major pieces of legislation. The first one was war powers, and we're not going to talk about Vietnam, but that's where that came from. And the president vetoed it. They overrode that veto. So when it came down to the next big issue, the impoundment issue, the Budget Control and Impoundment Act of 1974, Congress passed it, and Richard Nixon gritted his teeth and signed it. Now, partly it was because he'd already been overridden on war powers. The other reason was he was 1 month away from resigning because of the Watergate scandal. So his great mandate from 1972 was very much in the rearview mirror by the time he signed the Budget Control and Impoundment Act. But that's how we got it. It set up the Congressional Budget Office that had never existed before. The Budget Office had only been in the executive branch. And it also set up 2 budget committees in the House and Senate that had never existed before, and gave them the task of writing a budget resolution every year that would then kick off a process leading to this process, to that process. And since we are not in Government 321, which we will be tomorrow morning, very nice to see some of you early tonight, I'm not going to get into all of those processes, except to say that where we are today with respect to the budget, the 2025 budget, which is still not finished, and we've got a March 14th deadline coming up that could close down the government, or the 2026 budget, which is the first new Trump budget, and which is the subject of all this angst and sturm und drang at this point. What are we going to spend money on? What aren't we going to spend money on? The Senate has one version, the House has a very different version. And even though the senators set up theirs to please Trump, Trump has just decided he's siding with the House. So all kinds of mishigas coming on that front. But I'm just saying that Congress, too much of the time, and I mean, maybe I'm expressing a prejudice here, but scholars, I think, would generally agree that Congress has too often in those intervening 50 years ceded, sometimes obeying before negotiation, and sometimes just plain giving in to the idea that the president has a kind of unitary authority, and we'll come back to that word later.
So this is a question some of the students here have done moot court before. Where do you draw the line between the exercise of power or the inaction, in the case of Congress, that is sort of not to our pleasure, not wise, and a constitutional crisis? When are we in crisis? When, under what circumstances? Today is most likely not the end of history. We might find ourselves here again. What are the indicia of the system really being under distress or not working? And are you seeing any of those now?
So I think the term I use actually is constitutional failure. But constitutional crisis is important too, partly because it's gotten a lot of usage. I think what people mean by, one of the problems with constitutional crisis, not always very clearly defined, but I think what people mean by that, there's just an article in the New York Times about this a few days ago, is a situation where you have a standoff between two branches and one branch has exerted authority and it's not clear they're going to listen to the other branch. Particularly, people have meant that in the context of court decisions. I mentioned there have been some court rulings on the 14th Amendment. They attempted to unilaterally change the 14th Amendment on attempts that Ron was talking about to impound money, just not spend money, that perhaps the Trump administration is already not obeying. So people are talking about constitutional crisis in that context. I would say, and let me introduce another idea here, that it probably is familiar to many people. Something to keep in mind, one of the reasons what's happening right now is so unusual, this is a president with clear authoritarian ambitions. That's been true since the 2016 election campaign. There's a book called How Democracies Die. People know about this book. It's a useful book in part because it describes a couple of tests you can use to identify would-be authoritarian. Based on Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zilbach, two political scientists, wrote this book based on research they've done in different parts of the world. And they concluded, interestingly, that whether you're talking about Venezuela or Russia or Hungary or the United States, authoritarians, which is people who reject liberal democracy, who basically reject limits on power and the rule of law, they all use the same tactics. They can be identified by the same test. And Donald Trump has met all of the tests in a textbook way since the 2016 campaign, continuing during his first term, during his campaign in 2024, and now. So that's when you talk about, that's why I say constitutional failure, to your question about identifying this term. To me, something I wrote about a few years ago that I've thought about is, in a liberal democracy, a system with free and fair election, but when you win an election, you can't just do whatever you want. That's sort of what we're seeing now. People are using the term electoral dictator or an elected dictator, somebody who wins an election and then says, I'll do what I want. That's not liberal democracy. In liberal democracy, you win the election, but people still have rights. You can't just throw your opponents in jail or violate statutory laws or change the Constitution unilaterally. There are limits on power. There are independent judges, and there's equality. People are equal. People are able to participate in politics as long as they're adults and citizens. They can run for office. They can vote. In a liberal democracy, by definition, an authoritarian who rejects liberal democracy is an existential threat to that system. So to me, when you have somebody like Donald Trump, who's shown all these warning signs, probably most clearly on January 6th, 2021, but we can talk about other evidence too. When that happens and the system does not act legally to remove him from office, bar him from running again, to me, that's constitutional failure. So I think what we're experiencing now is the aftermath of constitutional failure. When you have somebody who runs a campaign describing authoritarian goals. If I'm elected, I'm going to be an agent of retribution against my political opponents. I'm going to use the military within the United States against my political opponents. When they're elected and the system did not stop them, then you see what that means in practice. And one of the things it means in practice, your point about constitutional crisis, is not surprisingly, I think Donald Trump, in part because of the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus the United States on presidential immunity, believes, I think, sadly to me, probably reasonably believes that there are no limits on what he can do. So that's where we get to this constitutional crisis point that people are identifying, which I think is useful because Ron and I were talking about this before we started. One of the problems is for many people, this may not be something that registers. I've talked to people, maybe you have too. I talk to people who say, you know, life's going on and things are relatively normal for me, and it may be. That's something that scholars find too. Tom Popinski, who's a professor at Cornell, wrote a piece that came out in 2017 that said, in an authoritarian regime, life for many people can be boring and tolerable. If you're not a public figure, if you're not in politics, if you're not an owner of a business, your life may go on. He said he studied in Malaysia at the time, which interestingly was an authoritarian regime for decades, but then the authoritarian regime lost an election eventually, even though they staffed the election in their favor. But what he said in his piece was, for many people, they're just living their life. They're going to school, they're going to work. They care about things running on time and their kids getting into good schools and taking vacations, things like that. So that's where this constitutional crisis piece, I think, is useful potentially because it's gaining focus among reporters, and maybe I'm sure Ron knows this more than me. Maybe that's something that can shine light on this, and people can say, well, wait a second, things seem normal, but now we have a president who maybe already is defying, or will soon defy it. It's not completely clear. He may have already done this, court orders. And so maybe that will be an opportunity for people to say, hey, this is a crisis. So even though, you know, in a pedantic kind of way, I would say, well, I think it's already been constitutional failure. It doesn't really matter. If the goal is describing what's going on and giving people a way to respond to it, the term crisis, I think, is very useful.
Ron, I want to bear down on this because I hear two ideas in what Chris has said that seem interesting to me. And one of them, many, but two in particular, I think that are really challenging. One is, you know, possibly I'm going to push back a little, like this idea, like we know these actions are bad because the guy who we know is an authoritarian did them. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on kind of the independent extra legality of these actions. And the other is, and I think this matters with Congress as well, you know, if the constitutional crisis is a bit about this intent, it's a bit about this authoritarian moment that we're in, is there a difference between being a member of Congress saying like, look, I'm going to sign off on a budget that says we don't give a dime to a starving person in another country ever again, because I don't want to, because that's who I am and that's what I believe and that's what I think we should do, and allowing, for example, USAID to be kind of gutted and pillaged and shuttered because the strong man wants it. Is there a difference in those two ways of governing that a member of Congress might engage in?
Well, not to a starving child.
No.
And in the end, if we're going to try to hold some standard of reality high in all of this, consequences, I think, have to be our watchword. We have to watch for the consequences to sink in. Now, we talked a lot about saving democracy during the last election. Academics did, journalists did, many people did. I don't think it sank in on everyone. There were people who heard it, knew exactly what we were saying, and rejected it and simply said, well, we don't see Donald Trump as a threat. Maybe he's going to be autocratic, if you want to call it that, or some other fancy word, but basically he's going to do stuff we approve of. And so we approve of him, and therefore we're not that troubled about, you know, whether or not he's an autocrat, or we're not worried about protecting democracy. And I think we've all been so steeped, and this is a great American freedom, right? It's a great American freedom that we have, freedom from want, freedom from fear, et cetera, the Roosevelt fears. We've also had a freedom from politics for a lot of people. It's not like this in some countries. If you live in Gaza, you are not free of politics. The consequences are all around you. And that's true of many other countries as well. We have been blessed, if that's the right word, or spoiled, certainly that's applicable as well, by peace and prosperity, by and large, and by a reasonably tolerant, not to everyone, not all the time, but a broadly speaking, more tolerant political culture, so that people don't feel forced to the wall. They don't feel necessary to, organize and get guns and fight the government. That's a great freedom. It is possibly our most paramount freedom. And yet, here we are with people unable to see the threat to it because it has been so stable in their lifetime for them. Many people see it differently, and they can understand the threat to their rights much more readily. But for those of us who have been privileged pretty much to the max, that I think applies to not all, but many, many of us here at AU, we don't feel the threat as viscerally. We don't believe it when somebody says our democracy is under threat until we start to see consequences. And I'm not, of course, eager to see the consequences, but if they are coming, and I believe they are, then I believe we will start to have a real test of what's going on. That's in response to one of the two things that you were saying. As far as the sort of orange man bad thing, which I think is quite real, that all this other stuff is political rhetoric to most people, and political rhetoric it is. But they are inclined to say, gee, if Obama had done that, you wouldn't have been so disturbed. And there were some things that Obama did that were fairly high-handed. And he was not necessarily always successful in those things, and Congress did push back on him on a number of occasions. But he did try to press his agenda, and when frustrated by Congress, he did things like DACA by executive order. And if you approve of that, you weren't troubled by his doing that by executive order. But executive orders, as I think Chris has already said, are subject to pushback from federal judges, as that one was, and are also subject to Congress passing a law to the contrary. So we will see if the federal judges push back, if the administration steps back, if Congress passes a law, will this administration recognize that law, or are they prepared to say, no, we are a higher power now. We have an authority beyond what the Constitution might have envisioned. They wouldn't use that language. But we have a higher authority because, well, as Trump himself has said, he who saves his country violates no law, quote unquote.
Can there be, and I'll get to the post-its in a sec as well, so we'll have some audience questions. Can there be a constitutional failure of the polity? I mean, if some majority of those of we the people who decided to vote at all chose the person who did promise to be a dictator on day one, and if the message of save our democracy did not resonate with a sufficient number of people, is this the Constitution in operation? In other words, people can choose through a free and fair election to replace democracy with something else? Or is this a form of constitutional failure? Are we the people subject to this these same standards, I guess? And thanks, Grant.
So yes, that's a great question. James Madison said in Federalist 51, the people are the primary check on government power. That was long before the United States was a liberal democracy. Of course, there was slavery at the time. Women weren't part of the political system. But the heart of a liberal democracy is people, is the voters. And the reality, as Lara rightly says, is an important point, is that part of what it means to have democracy is it can be ended by the voters. That's just a reality. No system can guarantee that it succeeds. When I talk about constitutional failure, the reason I've been making that point is to argue that things should be done. This is more in the past. Now we're kind of past this, but in the past I was arguing things should have been done to strengthen the system, to increase the odds that democracy survives. But there's no guarantee. And the point I'm making here is not that Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler, although there have been some chilling parallels recently, but he's not Adolf Hitler. Joseph Goebbels was a Nazi, and he was elected to the German Reichstag before Hitler was chancellor. And Goebbels said publicly, he said, if a democracy will give us the tools to destroy it, they'll let me be in the German Reichstag and parliament. They'll give me free train travel, other perks of the office. I will use those tools to destroy it. He said this openly. That's the reality of democracy. I don't blame voters first and foremost. I mean, people have a responsibility. But as Ron very rightly said, in ordinary times, this is true even for me, maybe for many of you. I've been interested in politics since I was a kid. But I always I did have that luxury that Ron mentioned before to not always pay attention. There were times I didn't follow things super closely. Last 10 years, that hasn't been possible. I don't feel able to do that. But many people have had that experience and may still have it. And I don't blame people for that. They should be able to. In a normal, healthy democracy, you shouldn't have to watch every second to see, wait a second, was there just someone confirmed to be director of the FBI who has a list of enemies who he wants to go after? That just happened today. You shouldn't have to follow things that closely. What I really blame though, more than voters, is elites. And that's, again, this book, How Democracies Die, that I mentioned, this is the point they make. They say in their book and in other writings, you can't count on voters to save democracy for various reasons. Voters aren't always, it's not always the top priority for them. Voters define democracy in different ways. They might not be following politics super closely. What's really important, again, nothing guarantees that democracy survives, but they argue that really the best tool to save democracy is elites. Elites can take actions to screen out would-be authoritarians, to stop them peacefully and legally, and that didn't happen. January 6th was a really important moment when it seemed like maybe it would, but it didn't. Ron and I were talking before we started that one question in 2022 and 23, I guess in 21 as well, was maybe Trump won't be the nominee for the Republicans. Maybe it'll be Nikki Haley, maybe it'll be Ron DeSantis. These might be people that certainly most Democrats, if not all, would not prefer, but they probably wouldn't be, I think almost certainly, but it probably wouldn't be the same kind of a threat to democracy as Donald Trump. And elites could have made that happen. Right after January 6th, Mitch McConnell, who was the Republican Senate leader at the time, said very clearly and very publicly, he said, Donald Trump caused this attack on the Capitol. He's to blame for it. But he crucially, well, maybe I'm overstating it, it's importantly, did not vote to remove Donald Trump from office. He argued that by the time the trial took place in the Senate, there was a vote, Trump had already left office. So Senator McConnell said, we can't, Ron mentioned this point, really good one about accountability. We can't hold him accountable by removing him from office, but we have a criminal justice system in the United States. He can be accountable here and there. So that was a real failure of elites. Republican elites, many of whom, when Liz Cheney was speaking up against Donald Trump and voted for impeachment and was on the January 6th committee, she said that many Republicans would privately tell her, we agree with you. We think you're right. But we're afraid to do what you're doing, either because we might lose our job, or Ron and I were talking this before the event started too, maybe because of physical fear. I don't know, have people seen some of the reporting recently about this? Senator Tillis reportedly, I think some of this was public, was concerned about Pete Hegseth's nomination to be Secretary of Defense. Hegseth was a host on Fox News, didn't have a lot of experience. He'd been in the military, but not in running a large bureaucracy. There were concerns about, really serious concerns about sexual assault and abuse for him. And also, he had been identified as an insider threat in the military because of a tattoo he has that I think it says Deus Vult, God wills it, white supremacist reference apparently. Senator Tillis was concerned about this, and reporting indicated he might vote against him. And Hegseth, I believe Vance broke the tie there, right? So Tillis could have made the difference. There was reporting that Tillis was getting death. Well, Tillis said this, he was getting death threat. So Republican elites, either because, as I said, they're telling Liz Cheney, we agree with you, either because they're afraid for their office, which may be true for Tillis too. He has an election coming up. Donald Trump was saying, apparently was on a plane with a bunch of people in North Carolina with Tillis was from, and said, which one of you should I support in the primary? When it was possible that Tillis would vote against Hegseth. Republican elites who were concerned for their job or their safety or both did not act. And so to the point, and of course, the people are the heart of a democracy, but because, as Ron says, people may not follow things so closely, and they shouldn't have to. There's a lot of reliance on elites, and elites really fail, I think, in a lot of ways.
So I think we have a
Oh, yes.
really great questions from the audience, and I'll actually go around and grab some more, but Grant is going to feed some of these questions to you.
Yeah, okay, so this one for you, Ron. How is what Musk is doing legal, and could legislation curb his actions?
I cannot, well, the question, did everyone hear the question? Is what Musk is doing as opposed to Trump. Not that he isn't doing it under the color of authority passed on from Trump, who keeps saying, oh, he doesn't do anything I don't approve of, which I sincerely doubt, but let's just take him at his word. What he is doing is at least outside of our experience. Let's put it that way. There have been lots of advisors to presidents. And I've been recently looking back at Ronald Reagan's first months in office when he came in talking about, among other things, eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. Exact same words, waste, fraud, and abuse. That's all we really need to do is get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. And then everything will be fine. And he brought in a fellow by the name of David Stockman, who had actually been an elected member of Congress, made him the director of Office of Management Budget, and tasked him with essentially bringing federal spending to heel, bringing the budgets of all the departments in line. And then he proceeded to try to sell that to Congress. Now that, of course, is regular order. That's normal procedure. You try to get Congress to do it. And you, of course, build up a big head of steam in the polity among your supporters and in the media, and in friendly media in particular, but in all the media, because we all covered it, talking about how we're going to get the federal budget under control. And that gets a certain head of steam behind it, and you can get a lot more out of Congress that way than you might otherwise. And you had a majority in the Senate, first Republican majority in a generation. So there was a lot of momentum there. They certainly didn't want to buck Ronald Reagan any more than the Senate today wants to buck Donald Trump. I mean, they may not like Donald Trump, you understand, but they really do understand that dynamic that Chris has just been describing about what happens to their political future and even what happens to their personal situation in the world and that of their families. So they're not going to buck Donald Trump. And of course, Reagan also had a fairly pliant House, even though it was nominally Democratic. Well, much of the Democratic majority came from the South and was already transitioning to being very Republican oriented, and certainly also not willing to be against Ronald Reagan at the zenith of Ronald Reaganism, if you will. And he was the answer for many people, much as Trump is today. So he had his, if you will, parallel figure in David Stockman, but David Stockman actually had a government job. He was the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Today, that's a guy named Russell Vogt. He is very much simpatico with all of this program we're talking about, and he's pushing it very hard, but he's pushing it from the standpoint of his official position. What's different about Trump giving all this power to Musk is that he's not responsible to anyone except Donald Trump, and we're not even sure for certain that he's taking orders from Donald Trump. I mean, he's infiltrating the computers of Treasury and IRS and so forth and getting a lot of data. One assumes that would be highly personal, and that could theoretically be of great use to, say, Elon Musk, and also obviously to Donald Trump, and doing it probably in an extra legal fashion, but stopping a bunch of people who show up with the protection of US Marshals, people with badges, and say, hi, we're here to work on the computers. That's a physical problem. That is a physical enforcement problem, and not something that Congress is in any sense equipped to do. So that part of it, I think the Doge part, the DOGE part, the Musk part, is hard to find a real parallel to. You can talk about things that were similar, but it's hard to call that the same animal. And if the courts need something to latch onto to start finding defiance or extra legality in what Trump is doing, I think the Musk piece is a good candidate.
Yes. Do you mind if I get?
No, please.
I'm a lawyer by background, so I hear the law question, I get really excited. I'm sure Lara is, he's also there. Ron's right. The Doge piece, it really raises an issue, but there are 2 points. The first is, as Ron rightly suggests, is Musk even legally authorized to do what he's doing? There's a lawsuit that's just brought about this. Sort of a technical issue, so I won't get too far into it. But the basic point is, under the Constitution, the president can appoint officers. Either officers who are described by the Supreme Court as principal officers, means people like cabinet secretaries who don't report to anyone else other than the president, or people who are called inferior officers. That's language in the Constitution. It doesn't mean like lesser people, just means they're in a lesser office. Inferior officers sometimes need to be confirmed by the Senate too. And if they're not, there needs to be a law that creates their office. Elon Musk doesn't seem to fit any of those categories. He's been described as a special government employee. But calling someone whatever you want doesn't obviate the constitutional issue. And this lawsuit that was brought alleges that Elon Musk, because he hasn't been confirmed by the Senate, and also some of the people on his team, simply are not legally authorized to be doing what they're doing. Second problem, as Ron also rightly points out, is even if they are legally authorized, you can be a cabinet secretary, you can be someone in the government. It doesn't mean you can violate the law. Even if Donald Trump was doing this himself personally, you cannot impound money. You can't freeze money that's been authorized by Congress. That's unconstitutional. It also violates the statute. Ron mentioned the Impoundment Control Act. You cannot shut down federal agencies like USAID that were created by statute. That's illegal. And so whether he's properly in his position or not, or people in his team, those are clear violations. There are also, as Ron again rightly pointed out, there are questions about, you can read all these stories, it's overwhelming to keep track. Elon Musk shows up, or his team, at USAID, and they want access to the system. And two people working for USAID tell them, sorry, you can't, you're not authorized. And they're pushed aside, I guess, as Ron, I assume by somebody with guns. I don't know, but they're pushed aside, they're put on leave. Was that legal? Did they legally have the right to get access to this information? There's a law called the Privacy Act. There's just reporting the last couple of days that Musk and his team are getting access to Social Security information, people's tax returns, corporate tax returns too, I guess. The Privacy Act spells out when that can legally be done and when it can't be. And no matter what role Elon Musk is in, he can't violate the Privacy Act. There's been discussion of classified information. Now, the president can give anyone any classification that he or she wants. But if they don't, you can't magically get access to classified information, much less make it publicly available, which apparently there were reports that some of this was. So yes, there are a number of legal issues here. And some of this is being litigated in court. The important problem, though, as Ron pointed out, though, too, is, I was talking to people about this before the event started, Elon Musk has already signaled this. So has JD Vance. I think Donald Trump, too. Yeah, of course, well, through the comment that Ron cited, he who saves his country violates no law. The question is, will they follow court orders? And logically, to me, I don't expect that they would.
We have another couple questions. Chris, we'll start with you this
Okay.
time. This one says, why hasn't this happened before? What's changed?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's changed? Law, politics,
Yes,
social
yes, yes.
norms. And then there's another one that contextualizes that well. I think it says, what's stopping this from happening again?
Yeah, well,
I think that's for both.
yeah, Ron's gonna have, do you want to start on that one?
Why hasn't this happened before? I think you can point to things that are similar in the past, but you have to point fairly far into the past. I don't think this is similar to Reagan.
Right.
There might be some superficial things about it. I don't think it's really similar to what happened with Nixon, because what we saw with Nixon in that same 2-year period was the system writ large, Congress certainly, investigating him in a bipartisan fashion, House and Senate, very outstanding leadership from Republicans in the Senate on that score. We also saw a tremendous amount of pushback to Nixon in the executive branch, and finally, even paramount sense, in the judicial branch, where they all said, no, time out. Yes, you won 49 states, but you can't do this. You can't do that. And you certainly can't engineer a cover-up of a crime, a series of burglaries and so forth that were conducted in connection with the 1972 election campaign, and then say that's just all fine because it was done in the service of electing me president. That was prohibited, in essence, by a consortium of pushback from both parties in all three branches, including even the executive branch, where, you know, it was really the Justice Department's special prosecutor who drove the whole train. So we saw the system really work in that particular case. And I think a lot of us who were, you know, sentient, but very much younger at the time, were enormously encouraged by that. And I think even to some degree, enticed by it into government and into being interested in government as a subject for whatever kind of study you wanted to do, whether you were going to be in government or a student of government or in the media, you were, I think, inspired is not too strong a word to use, by how well the system worked in 1973 and 74 in dealing with the challenge that was not unlike Trump in many respects that came from Richard Nixon and some of his, you know, darker associates. So that, I think, is a part in the past to the good. But there have been other times. You mentioned LB, you know, not LBJ in this case, but FDR,
Yes.
stretching it.
Yes.
And certainly during World War I, Woodrow Wilson did extraordinary. That's not why they took his name off the high school, but he did a remarkable thing to push the law with the Sedition Act and so on, and suppression of the media, suppression of dissent. In World War, I'm sorry, we're out of world wars. I'll have to go back to the 19th century and talk about the Civil
Might
War.
be able to cook up another one for you.
Bad choice of words on my
That's
part.
true.
Abraham Lincoln, I mean, among other things, the state of Maryland was about to secede from the Union and have a vote on it up in Annapolis. And they were interrupted in that legal process by the arrival of federal troops who said, no, you won't. Because Abraham Lincoln was not about to have the entire District of Columbia surrounded not only by Virginia, a secessionary state, but also by Maryland, a secessionary state, but Maryland was a slaveholding state and was about to leave the Union. So that's what you'd call stretching the envelope a good bit,
Yep.
even though he was doing it to defend the Union, which was obviously his job. But still, having the legislature interrupted by armed men that you sent in is certainly pushing the envelope. So there are things from the past. And I think a lot of us kind of went to sleep on this a little bit over the last several decades, thinking that not only the spirit of Watergate, but also other things that happened in the election history of the last 50 years were moving us in a certain direction and away from autocracy and away from this kind of flirtation with dictatorship, even if it's going to be dictatorship of the people, totalitarianism. This is food for more than thought. This is food for more than thought. It's a challenge that I think has to change our lives. It just already has for many of us. And I think it has to be a challenge to what we thought our business, proper business, was going to be as American citizens. I think we have to feel, to a very large degree, put on the spot by history with all of this. And I hope that's why all of you are here. And I think it's something that we will all need to sort out for ourselves, talk to our own consciences, talk to our own families. But I think this is history calling us in a moment of danger, at a moment of fraughtness for our democracy. Am I getting over the top here, Chris?
No, you're not.
Okay.
And no. That's right. Let me just emphasize a couple points you made. You're right. Why hasn't this happened before? Well, as Ron suggested, this sort of has. Nixon was trying to establish and consolidate authoritarian power, but as Ron rightly points out, the big difference was the parties were different, and Republicans at the time said no in a way that's inconceivable now. There were other presidents, as Ron also rightly points out, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, who took actions. I think probably most clearly Franklin Roosevelt. Yesterday was the anniversary of Executive Order 9066, which led to the internment of Japanese Americans.
Yeah,
that's certainly, as Ron rightly points out, that's overreach. The difference, though, even for presidents like Roosevelt or George W. Bush, who took actions, George W. Bush, Ron mentioned the unitary executive theory before. The Bush administration relied on the unitary executive theory to claim the authority to set aside criminal laws. Torture is a crime under US law. The Bush administration concluded because the president controls the executive branch, if Congress passes a law that in the president's view infringes an executive power, the president can set it aside. That's a challenge to the rule of law. But George W. Bush was not an authoritarian. He did not seek to shut down elections. He did not talk about putting his opponents in jail. He did not try to stay in office after his second term ended. Donald Trump will try that if he can. He's talked about it. He's serious, to Ron's point about the danger. So, yeah, forbearance, self-restraint was an important check on presidents in the past. Most presidents simply didn't have authoritarian ambitions. And the one prominent one, who Ron described quite correctly, who did, Nixon, was stopped by his party. So absolutely, you're right. I agree with you.
I have another here if I can. So this is just about the US. So how could US businesses be impacted by Trump's policies?
Well, it doesn't have to impact you too much if you don't do business with anybody outside the United States. Well, I only say that half meaning.
Yes.
Because it's going to affect US businesses. I try never to make reference to anything that happens on Wall Street, but the Dow did go down 600 points today. And that's being attributed to concerns among investors about tariffs, which many of us had thought of as being a relic of another century, policy terms that maybe you would use here and there, advisedly, strategically, surgically. But the idea that we would suddenly put tariffs on everybody who has tariffs around the world, or that we would put special tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, so forth, really seems beyond anachronistic and is so much in opposition to the spirit of world trade that has been the hallmark of the post-World War II period, led by the United States. That world prosperity was a goal for all countries to pursue and for the United States to lead in the pursuit of. What we have done now is a 180-degree turnaround to say, no, free trade, not good. And everybody should be out for themselves, and every American business should operate under that assumption. And every American business should see itself in competition with the rest of the world, and in addition to the businesses they're in competition with here in the United States. That is going to change the way many people see their business model. Now, I'm not saying that everyone's going to change their business model overnight, or that they're going to do it in the same way. They're not. But everyone is going to be affected the longer that regime carries on. And right now, I don't see anything really challenging the imposition of the tariffs, except, of course, the usual mercurial question: how will Trump feel about that tariff he imposed yesterday, tomorrow? Because he does use it as a negotiating tactic. I do understand that. But in the long run, I think he wants. I don't think there's really any other reason to admire William McKinley. And to name a mountain again after him, except your admiration for his tariff policy. That's really why Trump goes back to McKinley over and over and over.
Yes, but McKinley's tariffs, of course, to Ron's point about the danger, led to a depression in the United States. And this, Ron has made this point a couple of times, really important one, just to amplify it a little bit. So Lara mentioned about, the people as a check on democracy. Of course, Congress can be, but they haven't acted. The courts are doing some things. We'll see what happens with that. Another check, any person, even someone like Vladimir Putin, has to worry about public opinion. It's even if you're an authoritarian who's really consolidated power, it's still a problem. So what if, as Ron has rightly suggested, it's not something to hope for because it's horrible, but you just mentioned about the stock market. What if these tariffs lead to really bad economic consequences? What if all this uncertainty, you always hear about businesses want certainty. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. What's going to happen with tariffs? So many people are being laid off the federal government. What kind of pressures is this going to put in the economy? Is that something that's a political problem for Trump? And then relatedly, so Ron, in addition to teaching here, of course, worked for a public broadcaster. Many journalistic outlets are not public. They're privately owned. And we've seen pressure on them. Some of this before the election even. The Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post both would not endorse a presidential candidate. People referred to that at the time as anticipatory obedience. And since the election, we've seen more of this. All those, I guess, billionaires, right, were lined up at the inauguration. We're giving money to Trump's inaugural committee. Private companies, some of which own media outlets, which are settling cases with Donald Trump. This is all what you would expect in an authoritarian context. So the kind of stuff that happened in Russia. When Putin came to power 25 years ago in Russia, he made a deal with the oligarchs. He said, you can make money, but don't get involved in politics. Don't cross me politically. And it's really, to me, as somebody reading about these issues, to see that, it's exactly what you would expect, but it's so surreal to see. And I agree with Ron's point that he's made a couple of times about the real danger for Trump is the possible consequences. But of course, that's a danger for all of us, as you point out too.
It will be interesting to see his, as you mentioned, polls.
Yeah.
And public opinion
Yes.
is important, yes, even to Putin.
Yes.
And in fact, Putin, one could argue, has had a lot of his success because he's had a lot of public support. You know, the Russians were happy with the changes that he brought in after Yeltsin and the mess of that period of time and their unsuccessful experiment with democracy, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And there's some of that in the United States as well. People saying, well, okay, I don't care for this and I don't care for that. And it does seem as though the rules have changed for Donald Trump, but everything's going pretty well for me. Well, that
Yeah.
would be interrupted by more inflation. So if inflation takes off again after having been slowly strangled by the Federal Reserve Board, after it was brought under control with 2 very painful years of Federal Reserve Board rate increases, if it takes off again, and it's already ticked up,
Mhm.
but if it takes off again, and everybody picks on the price of eggs,
Yes.
but there it is, right? There it is. It's gaudy. I mean, you look at it, it's absolutely.
It's like
absurd.
$9 a dozen. right?
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. And the restaurants are stopping serving things with eggs in it
Yeah.
and so on. If that kind of absurdity, if that sort of thing continues, then I think Donald Trump's numbers will come down. And when he's back down around, let's pick a number 40, because we tend to deal in, big round numbers. Let's say he gets down from flirting at 50 for a couple of weeks, all the way down to 40. He's going to feel that. He's going to feel like a chill from a window that's open. And we will then, I suspect, see something like we saw in the first term, some moderation here and there. Somebody's head will roll. Maybe the bromance with Elon will break down. Something will happen. I expect, but on the other hand, I can't guarantee that.
Correct.
And that's what's different. And that's one of the things that I find chilling, is that I don't feel as confident that he will respond even to a decline in his polls.
That's right. Or I'll give, not to downplay what Ron's saying, because that's a real possibility. He also might respond by going further and trying to consolidate power and saying, this is an emergency. I mentioned Roosevelt takes office in 1933, says it's an emergency on declaring a bank holiday. Trump could say, this is an emergency, I need more power. So that's a danger too. But I'm not trying to gainsay what you're saying. You're right. It's still a danger for Trump.
I'll ask another one here. This says, what could Democrats realistically do in this situation? And there's another one on here that says, it's sort of like Democrats may be concerned to admit that there's all this going on in the constitutional crisis, given that maybe they can't respond.
Mhm.
What would you say Democrats realistically could do?
I suspect that's a better one for you, Ron.
Oh.
Although it's a tough one for anyone.
Yeah, but
Sorry.
it's tough to be responsible for the Democrats.
Yeah.
I must say, though, who are the Democrats? Well, obviously, the leaders in Congress. So Chuck Schumer, who's been around for a long time and has a lot to explain, a lot to account for.
Mhm.
You've got Hakeem Jeffries, who is someone I think has had his eye on a few years from now for a long time. He's thinking in terms of the mid to late 2020s, maybe the 2030s, and what the Democrats might be able to accomplish then. And in the meantime, as he has said, and maybe too candidly, there aren't a lot of things they can do legislatively, especially in the House, where even a one vote, and that's what it is right now, functionally a one vote majority. But as long as the Republicans all show up, they've got all the power. Now, right now, we're waiting on 2 or 3 guys who have said, I don't know if I like this House budget resolution that you guys are planning, because you're going to cut the hell out of Medicare. And I know Trump says that we didn't and we wouldn't. And it's not Medicare, that's the first target, it's Medicaid.
Mhm.
But once you start with Medicaid, then it's not that long a step to Medicare. And it's not that long a step from there to Social Security. And if Trump is really listening to Elon Musk, you are talking to Ayn Rand. You're talking to somebody who has no use for Social Security or any other such program. The American people do. I mean, across the board, writ large. But even something like Medicaid, Kentucky, Louisiana, Arkansas, West Virginia, those 4 states are in the top tier of Medicaid states. They have, seriously, more than 1/3 of the residents of the state are on Medicaid. And it goes up from 1/3 to like 40% of the statewide
That's amazing,
residents
yeah.
are on Medicaid. They all voted 60 to 70% for Trump. Now, I'm not saying they're going to turn around and, wish they had voted for Kamala Harris. They probably aren't. But those are the people Donald Trump counts on to always be with him. And when they start finding out that they're going to be looking at tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills that aren't going to be covered by Medicaid, they may start to have second thoughts. That's what I mean by consequences.
Questions from the
Oh, yeah.
audience?
Let's see, let me ask this right here, I think it's interesting, so in the hypothetical that there's maybe an economic downturn and then there's not public backlash in a way, what does that tell us? And what does that tell us maybe specifically about the media and how that interaction goes with the public?
Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by downturn, I guess, but
Yeah.
you know, if there's really, if we if inflation becomes rampant again, or I suppose another possibility is that we could finally have this recession that's been predicted so many times. Anything like that, portions of the media, and I don't mean just MSNBC, but lots of people in the media are going to pounce on that and say, aha, this is our moment to, you know, really get harsh with Donald Trump and go after him. But how he reacts to that, as you say, it is hard to predict. There's a conventional response, which would be to moderate.
Right.
But there's also the other response, which is pedal to the metal. So the going gets a little tough, the tough get going. We can see that too.
Let me ask another question about the timeline of the courts and like how you think these things might move through the courts and when they will and when they won't and what that might look like. Did either of you guys?
Well, it's already moving. I mean, there are decisions. There was a court decision in Rhode Island from a district court where the court issued a temporary restraining order on freeze on federal spending, and then also said, the judge said, I'm concerned that the executive branch is not following my order. There have been orders in other cases on USAID, for instance, on rejecting that action to shut down USAID. So it's already happening. I guess an important question is, well, one important question obviously is the administration following these orders? It's not clear. Will it become clear one way or the other? And also, as these cases, at least some of them make their way up to the Supreme Court. Ron mentioned the unitary executive theory before. That's one of the, so I say all these things are illegal. Shutting down agencies, firing employees when there are statutes that give them protections. Something like 17 inspectors general were fired across different government agencies. Their job is to investigate corruption and fraud and illegality within their agency. They are protected under statute. You have to give them 30 days notice. You have to have a substantive reason why you're firing them. Those actions are illegal on their face. But the Trump administration has this theory, Ron mentioned before, the unitary executive theory. I mentioned in the context of the Bush administration. They used it somewhat differently there, though. What the Trump administration means by the unitary executive theory is we control the executive branch. It doesn't matter if Congress passes laws that create independent agencies like USAID or the Federal Reserve for that matter. We control them and the statutes can be set aside. That case, the Trump administration recently specifically asked the Supreme Court to reconsider precedent. Case called Humphrey's Executor from, I think it's 1935, longstanding Supreme Court precedent that rejects what's now called the unitary executive theory, that says actually, if Congress passes a statute that puts limits on presidential authority to fire people in independent agencies, the president has to follow that. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to consider that. I don't know, the Supreme Court doesn't have to take cases that come before it. It may not take the case, but it may, and it may take other cases too. On impoundment, probably most centrally, the Supreme Court ruled more than 50 years ago. I think it was 1973 for the train decision. I think it was 73. Right?
Train was right after the law was passed.
Oh, okay. So, oh, sorry, you're right. 75 is looking at, that's right. And Supreme Court in the train decision 9-0 said impoundment's unconstitutional. President can't do this.
Can't do.
But you know, they want to challenge that too. And so those cases will make their way up. I don't know, you know, whether the Supreme Court will take them for sure. And if they do, when they will decide them, sometime between now and the end of their term in June. So pretty soon, presumably, I would think it's likely. And then the question is, will the Supreme Court set some limits on presidential power, or will they defer? Will they overturn precedents like Humphrey's Executor? Will they accept the unitary executive theory? It's far from clear they will. If they do that, it would undermine lots of other decisions the court has made. This major questions doctrine that you may have heard about, where the court says the executive branch cannot decide major questions when there's legislation that addresses it. But it doesn't mean the court can't do it. the court issued a decision in Trump versus the United States last year that I find really, really startling. And really not supported in any way by constitutional history or the constitutional text. So that's an important question. Will the Supreme Court take these cases? If it does it issue opinions that endorse this, that what we've thought until now was illegal will be made legal? Which happened in Trump versus the United States last year. Will that happen in other areas too? And then if they don't, if they try to set limits, how does the Trump administration respond, as Ron's talked about before?
I have a question as well for you. Especially this being a teach-in. I know Grant has a few more questions.
Oh,
from
yes.
the crowd, and we have a mic if people want, but you're not gonna go home with all these fine people, I think, and they don't have you there for them. Where should people be? Where should they be watching? You know, what should they be reading? How can they get good information about, what is a crisis and what is governmenting?
Well, obviously, that's your
What are
point,
you
first of all.
doing? Well, I guess you can listen to Ron, obviously,
Yeah,
but.
no, I do think public media are important to have. And I hope that we continue to have them. Obviously, it's one of the question marks and one of the things that Elon Musk has made very clear he
Yes.
wants to eliminate. But not just the public media, the media in general. I'm always tempted to say when people say, well, where shall I look? I would say, look everywhere. Look everywhere. Try to have as broad a diet of media information as you possibly can. And I think your own instincts will tell you that some of these things are much more evidence-based, much more factually sensitive, much more aware of themselves than others. I think there's more and more, though, reliance not on what I would call real media, that is to say, something that gets in between people, but that self-indulgent thing we all enjoy, which is social media. And for lots of folks, that is their total media diet. They get social media. And they get told that what they think already or might think already is right, and everybody thinks so. Because everybody in their particular bubble, I'll have to use that word, I know it's a cliche, but in that bubble thinks so. And we have to be self-aware and say, we're all part of that too. People who work for NPR tend to get into an NPR bubble. People who work for Fox, I'm sure, get into a Fox bubble. And you can see it in people who go back and forth between different kinds of news organizations, how they change after a certain amount of time of, being over there with the cats, they start to sound more like cats than dogs. I mean, that's just human nature. That's why you have to try to look at more than you could possibly take in, that you have to try to apprehend as much as you possibly can, and then try to comprehend those parts of it that speak to you most, and apply all of your intellectual skills, all your education to trying to parse the difference.
Oh, sorry. Ron, let me leave some questions.
Sure.
Take a look through. Let me say briefly about that too. I wake up every morning, I listen to NPR. I'm grateful it exists. It's being threatened though. I think there's an investigation already begun, right?
Yes.
An investigation into what, one would ask? I mean, the Associated Press has been denied access to White House press conferences because they refuse to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. These are direct First Amendment challenges. This is really, really chilling stuff. I will say though, in addition to what Ron's saying about, I'm grateful for what's being reported. How else would we know? And hopefully we'll be able to continue in the same way to know. I am very glad if people want to be in touch. This is pretty much all I'm thinking about. Let me know. Seriously, I'm always glad to talk about it. Can I take one of these? So
Yeah.
there are questions coming up too. Let me just answer one, then Ron's looking at them too. Somebody said, yesterday the White House posted a picture of Trump wearing a crown that said, "Long live the king." What does this suggest about the remainder of Trump's term and the future of American politics? There's a congressman named Dan Goldman, maybe it was Daniel, I don't know, from New York, I think. He's a prosecutor by background. He was involved, I think, in one of the Trump impeachments. And I've been impressed by a lot of what he's done. Yesterday, he responded to that point. He posted on social media and he said, "Media, don't be distracted by this. Don't take her off the ball." I completely disagree. This is everything is under this heading. Donald Trump is trying to consolidate power, either as you can call it a monarch, the White House did. Donald Trump used that term too. He called himself the king when he was referring to a response he had to a local issue in New York, congestion pricing cars. He either wants to make himself a monarch or a dictator. He's either, in fact, one thing that's really striking to me about what Donald Trump's doing is he is going further in some ways than the power the British monarch had in 1776. England had a civil war in the 17th century. And it was a civil war between supporters of Parliament and supporters of broad power for the king, King Charles. Parliamentary side won, and Charles was executed, which I'm not advocating. I'm just describing what happened. I'm really not a violent person in any way. But that's what happened. And when that happened, there was a brief period where there was no monarch at all in England. Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protectorate, I think was his title. And then a monarch returned who was also seen as overbearing, King James. And he was forced out, this time not executed, but forced out through what they call the Glorious Revolution. When that took place in 1688 and 1689, Parliament asserted its authority. And among other things, it passed the Bill of Rights, which is part of the basis for why we have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution knew about this history and supported Parliament. The English Bill of Rights specifically said that the monarch would not be able to set aside laws that Parliament had passed. That's what Donald Trump is doing right now. This is his ambition. This is everything he's trying to do can be fit under that that heading. And this is not my area at all of thinking about sort of like political responses of Ron may have something more to say about this. But I saw some people responded to what Trump had said. Congressman Goldman said, don't be distracted by this. Other people were saying, hey, that's a pretty good, effective message. No kings. It's short, it's pithy, people can understand it. And I've seen people already using that. There was a protest today, I think, where somebody had this up as a sign. So yeah, I think that's not a distraction to me. That's the core. That's really the challenge right now is, will that vision of presidential power win out? A president who's above the law. That's the idea of a monarch. And again, even the British king in 1776 wasn't above the law in that same way that Donald Trump was proposing.
Oh, here's one of the other questions
Yes,
that you all asked. In a period of increasing polarization, and that's a key context here, I think, where the idea of there being a middle in Congress has largely disappeared. There was a time when both parties in Congress had wings. They had a conservative part of the Democratic Party, very strong part, and there was a fairly substantial liberal wing of the Republican Party. When I was a staffer in the Senate in the 80s, just about the most liberal guy on the committee I was serving on was Charles McC. Mathias from Maryland, and you couldn't tell him apart from most of the Democrats, either socially or in terms of his voting. But he was historically a Republican, and he still served as a Republican to the last day he was in the Congress. And there were lots of people like that in the House as well. Some of it was geographic, having to do with what part of the country you were from. And Ezra Klein makes the point that the framers, all the way back to the Constitution, were counting on two ways in which the country would be fractured. One was just geography, that people would be really convicted about what they had to do for their state. And the other was that they would have different ideas. And so geography and ideology would not always coincide. And you would have some liberals from otherwise conservative states, and you would have some people in each party who answered more to a particular bell ideologically. And for a long time, a lot of political scientists and a lot of journalists decried this. They were very upset about this. Got to get rid of all those, boll weevils, as they called them in the Democratic Party. We got to get rid of all these squishes in the Republican Party. Got to get rid of the rhinos. Let's purify the breed. And there was a certain logic to that. You can't really govern unless you can kind of get your party to vote together. But it went fairly far. And now we have reached the point of polarization where it's very hard to be any kind of moderate, really, in the Republican Party. And it's increasingly difficult to be any kind of moderate in the Democratic Party, certainly in certain states, California, for example. And it's a big one. So I think the polarization is critical, and in a period of tremendous polarization and constitutional failure, to adopt that phrase, and I do like it very much, can the system be changed peacefully? Well, I still think so. I still think so. I still believe in not only teachable moments, but teachable eras, that this could be an educational moment for the country. I don't mean to, I hope I'm not sounding Pollyanna-ish here. It's not my nature. I'm Scandinavian, but I think there's also that prospect that people coming to pay attention and get information leads to at least the potential for education and thought and taking things seriously and maybe getting involved. And I'd love to see more elections in which 65% of the people actually vote, because I think we get better results with that. I can't guarantee it, but I'd like to see less apathy. I'd like to see more involvement, and I'd like to see more educated voting.
Well, that leads really nicely into the next question, which is what can people do to help with what's happening, or to help stop what's happening? Sorry. That's a hard question, but I'll try to answer a bit. I mean, Ron just suggested some of it. If the Constitution has failed, logically, you need fundamental constitutional reform. That's not going to happen right now. And if it did, it would almost certainly be to advance anti-democratic goals. You know, there are people talking about, there's a member of Congress already who proposed legislation to allow Trump to serve a third term. So that's the kind of stuff that would probably be more likely to happen. But that's something that's worth thinking about. There are groups that are active on that, simply following what's going on, which is a real challenge. I feel overwhelmed often. I feel physically sick often, pretty much every day. It's difficult, but that's something. It serves authoritarians when people drop out, when people don't pay attention. To Ron's point about, in normal times, that's a luxury that people can afford. We can't now, so that's something that people can do. People can contact their members of Congress. When you're in DC, so you can go in person if you're able to do that. That can matter, at least in theory. It certainly mattered with, Ron mentioned Nixon before. We just had this extraordinary incident last Thursday. People hear about this. Sometimes people are calling it the Thursday afternoon massacre. Nobody was killed. People hear about this. The reason they use that term is they're comparing to the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973, when Nixon, the chief of staff at the time, Alexander Haig, to fire the special prosecutor Ron referred to before, a man named Archibald Cox, who was investigating the attack on the 1972 election and had learned that President Nixon had recorded conversations with the Oval Office. Nixon said, let's just shut it down. So Alexander Haig, the White House chief of staff, goes to the Department of Justice and tells the Attorney General, a man named Elliot Richardson, fire Archibald Cox. Richardson says, I can't do that. When I named Cox as special prosecutor, I said I would only remove him for wrongdoing. He hasn't done anything wrong. You're just trying to insulate yourself against investigation. He resigned. Number two person in the Department of Justice, a man named William Ruckelshaus, resigned or was fired, not completely clear, but he wouldn't do it. Finally, the number three person in the Department of Justice, a man named Robert Bork, who was later nominated to the Supreme Court, but defeated for other reasons. It didn't come up, actually, his role in the Saturday Night Massacre that I remember when he was nominated. I don't think.
It didn't come up. It didn't come up at the surface, but there was a theory at the time that Bork was cooked from the start because people would hold that against him, but it never surfaced.
Yeah, I don't remember if he never surfaced. That's interesting that, of course, you would think it at least possible. So Bork does it. People responded. People contacted their members of Congress and they said, this is outrageous. And now, to be fair, it was a very different Congress than as Ron has described, unfortunately. But members of Congress responded and they said, well, the Attorney General's resigned. We're going to need a new Attorney General, a man named William Saxby, I think was nominated. And when his hearings went on, senators in the Judiciary Committee made him promise to name a new special prosecutor, and he did. And that special prosecutor continued looking for the tapes, asking for them. Case goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court issues a decision. Nixon has to turn over the tapes. And Congress begins impeachment proceedings, and Nixon resigns. So, you know, I'm not, look, we're in a very different environment, but I think there's already evidence that people contacting members of Congress can still matter. There's been reporting about this. Remember, you may have seen this, been some reporting. I'm sure, obviously, Ron knows more about this than me, but I see some reporting about this, that members of Congress are saying they're getting enormous amounts of contact. from people, specifically, the reporting I've seen is specifically people concerned about Musk, right? Is that the concern?
That's right.
Yeah.
1,600 calls a day, according to Lisa.
There you go. Yes, Ron knows more about this than me. So, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, just Lisa Murkowski, one senator,
Ah.
one Republican senator, said she was getting 1,600 calls. Not precisely 1,600
Yeah.
every single day, but on an average, she was getting all these calls. And some of them doubtless were people saying, yeah, Elon Musk, go man.
Right. Of course, some people like it, but a lot don't.
But people by and large don't call Congress to say, you guys are great.
Yes.
So you got to figure most of those were complaints.
Yes, those are some things people do. I'm glad to talk to people individually about other ideas too. But do you have other questions you saw too? Or do you want to say more about that?
Oh,
'Cause you know more
no.
about
We have time for maybe like 2 more questions.
Oh, yeah.
You
You got something?
I'll do one and you should do one.
I don't think I have another one here, but please go ahead. Start with yours. Oh, you going too?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
I was kind of picking through.
Yes.
I'll take those. I haven't seen all of them.
All right,
Okay.
Yes,
but please do ask some more.
Thank
For
you.
sure. So I wanted to ask about like where to draw the line and who can sort of draw that line.
Yeah.
And distinguish maybe when Trump is out of line or when
Yes,
Musk is out of
yes,
line or when their
yes.
relationship is out of line. And I wanted to ask, do you guys think it will be courts, Congress, maybe someone within Trump's circle?
Mhm.
Where do you think that comes from and how do you think that might come to pass?
I see to you, the lawyer, because I can't see it being anybody but the courts.
I'm eager to talk. I really appreciate the question. Ron's right, of course. The courts are an obvious candidate. Lara made this point before, though, too. How do we know? How do you draw the line? Let me offer one way to do it. Ron's right, of course. Of course, the courts are important. We all can make decisions, though. We can decide. And let me offer a framework for doing this. We talked at the beginning, Lara asked a really good question about, like, how normal is this? The president's done this before. Not really. I mean, some Nixon to an extent, but even Ron said it wasn't the same kind of avalanche. What's different about this that's remarkable to me, as I mentioned before, is that Donald Trump is an aspiring authoritarian who makes that clear. The question before about this picture of him with the crown in his head, that's for real. He means this. He means this when he says, you know, people sometimes refer to it as a joke, might be in office 3 terms. He wants that. It doesn't mean he's guaranteed to get it, though. And so one way to think about this, we can say, when we see the president or someone in the administration, Musk or anyone else who's violating the law, that seems to me like a clear overstep. And obviously that leads to the courts that Ron's talking about. But there's probably people have heard this term norms, but people heard about that too. Norms are important too. When things are happening, they might not be illegal, but they're unusual. That can be a warning sign if it threatens democracy. I'll give you an example. I mentioned about the so-called Thursday night massacre. That may not be, it's probably not illegal. It might be actually. What happened on Thursday, I'm sorry, I mentioned the Saturday night massacre. On Thursday, what happened was the number 2 person in the Justice Department, a man named Emil Bove, who was Trump's personal lawyer. He represented him in the case in New York where Trump was convicted of 34 felony counts. Emil Bove instructed the U.S. attorney, woman named, I think her first name is Danielle Sassoon, to dismiss charges against Eric Adams, mayor of New York, involving corruption. And Sassoon said, "I won't do it." This is her word. She said it's a quid pro quo. And Bove had publicly said, "We're doing this, dropping charges against Eric Adams, a Democrat, so he will help Donald Trump advance his immigration enforcement goals." So she stepped down. Other people that in the U.S. Attorney's Office and Department of Justice stepped down as well. It's probably not illegal for the administration to do that. And eventually what they did is they found somebody who would agree to dismiss the case, and Emil Bove signed on to it as well. And he appeared in court to represent the administration, which is very unusual. They couldn't find a line prosecutor to do this. That's probably not illegal. It's a classic authoritarian tactic, though. When you see presidents or people working in the administration doing things, whether they're illegal or not, if they're illegal, Ron's right, you go to court, and then you hope the courts can make a decision that'll be upheld. Congress should be helping to enforce those decisions. I mentioned the context of Nixon. Supreme Court issues a decision, Congress back them up. That makes it much harder for the courts. Alexander Hamilton called the courts the least dangerous branch. They don't have a lot of power. They need someone to back them up. So if Congress doesn't do that, it puts them at a real disadvantage. But there are things, I'm a lawyer, so I think about things in a legal way a lot of time, but there are things that are happening that may happen that are not illegal, but still should raise warning signs. if people in the administration are doing things to consolidate power, if they're doing things to advance their personal profits, like Elon Musk is getting access to information that'll help him personally, or Donald Trump is sitting down to discuss a merger involving, I think it was a golf company or something, right? Yeah.
Golf
Yeah.
tours.
Yeah, there's like an antitrust issue, and Donald Trump sitting down and talk about it. He has a stake in one of the golf companies. And the question is he going to allow this to go through? I think probably yes. It's going to help him. Things like that are people, I think that's where we can draw the line too. We can say ourselves, we can say this is too much. And then the point Ron was making before, we can take action based on this. We can talk to our members of Congress. Why is this happening? I want to make sure you know about this. I'm upset about this. So that's something people can do too. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me ask another one. So in the instance that maybe it's the courts that are sort of the first ones that
Yeah.
I think they check this, what happens if Trump ignores the courts? What will happen in that
Yeah.
situation? What can Congress do? Or even could be
Yeah.
able to take steps at that point? What do you guys think is your thought on that?
The phrase Katie bar the door comes to mind.
Yeah, right.
There's really not much precedent other than maybe Andrew Jackson for a president straight up telling the court to go hang. Andrew Jackson at one point said the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And Andrew Jackson was a general, and everyone knew he spoke for the military. And even John Marshall wasn't going to be able to inveigh against an army. So there was a sense there of just running roughshod over the third branch. But that was what, 1836? Some, a year like
Yeah.
that. I mean,
Something like
we're talking about a nigh on to 2 centuries. And so we really shouldn't be using a precedent of that sort. I mean, if it had happened last week, I don't think it'd be a good precedent, but it's a
Right.
really, really dusty, remote thing. And even if Andrew Jackson's portrait was up next to Trump's desk in his first term, I'm not entirely sure that he knew why it was there. Steve Bannon hung it there because he saw Andrew Jackson as a true populist
Yes.
and thought that Trump would be a true populist. Steve Bannon, by the way, you may be aware, is off the ship and very upset about Elon
Very
Musk
anti-Musk,
and
yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
So I think there will be some, falling out among the inner circle, among the people who have been very important to Trump. There will be other voices, there will be contrary voices. I don't think that our system is set up very well to be taken advantage of by a would-be dictator, if that is what Trump is. And so I think he will find it an unruly class, and that he will find it a difficult herd of cats to herd. And we'll see. There have been no pushbacks from his own party thus far.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean there aren't going to be, and it doesn't mean that there can't be pushbacks from everybody else, especially people, and I'm speaking to Republicans here in particular, who are not now office holders, but who might see another day in the future in which they might want to be office holders, and perhaps even office holders who won office by having a little different view of democracy than Donald Trump's, even in the Republican Party. And I believe there will be.
Nikki Haley just made a comment criticizing Trump. I can't keep track. It was maybe, I think it must have been on Putin. One of the many things that's been going on recently is the Trump administration is aligning itself with Putin and against Ukraine and Europe. So yes, it'll be like, if the administration does not follow court orders, there are things courts can do to try to enforce the orders. Contempt, civil contempt, they're fining people in the administration, criminal contempt, which can also be fines, criminal fines, or even jail time. There can even be jail time for civil contempt. Trump can pardon people for criminal contempt, but not for civil contempt. But all those things still may not work. I mean, what if you fine Elon Musk? It doesn't matter. The guy's what, $40 or $40 billion. There's like 14 billionaires in the administration. So to Ron's point, that's what, going back to what Lara said at the beginning, that's a true moment of crisis. I mean, in my terminology, it's failure, but whatever you want to call it, that's a really seminal moment. That's a really important moment. If that happens, especially if they publicly do this, because then people will have to take sides, including Republicans in Congress. I no longer expect this. I've woken up pretty much every day last 10 years thinking, is this the day Republicans are going to say, you know what, there's some things that are more important than party, and it hasn't happened for the most part, with some important exceptions. I mentioned Liz Cheney before, Nikki Haley speak up there, but I think you can't count on Republicans, even if something like that happens, to really come out and take action. They could, And people should, especially, people who are represented by Republicans in Congress who care about this for whatever reason, doesn't have to be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. Maybe they can have an impact. That's possible, but that would be a really, really dangerous moment. I think what happens then is, assuming that there's no way to enforce the court's order, that Congress doesn't do anything, that the courts don't have any way to issue contempt that holds up. Then at that point, it just becomes a question of, can you have free and fair elections in 2026 and in 2028? And is there a way for voters to take action? And that always remains possible, but that can't be taken for granted.
I agree. It's saddening,
Yeah,
but
that's the reality. And none of this, by the way, is to say like, oh, it's over. Describing the reality, the first thing to do is you got to understand what you're dealing with. You describe the reality. It doesn't mean there are things people can't do. It doesn't mean anything. So there are two ways. When I say nothing's guaranteed, you can say, oh, nothing's guaranteed. Democracy could die. Yes. Nothing's guaranteed. Someone trying to consolidate powers in authoritarian or monarch might not succeed. It's really not clear. We don't know.
And it depends. I think this is maybe a good place to wrap. It obviously depends on us. So
Yes.
the
Yeah.
action items you can take, you're already doing one, keeping yourself informed. The second is keeping yourself engaged. I've been very naive about Congress, but and the tooth fairy and a bunch of other things. But one thing that's going on, there are death threats. That's a serious thing, and I
Yeah.
think people shouldn't discount that when it comes to the courts as well.
Yeah.
But another thing that's going on is that Donald Trump is more popular than elected Republicans in their districts and in their states. And at the time that he is less popular, they will do things differently.
Yeah.
One way they will know he is less popular is that when they hear more against him from we the people, than they hear for him. And so that consists of doing that now, if there's something you don't like. Now, I am an unrepresented resident of the District of
Yeah.
Columbia, so I just hold teach-ins. I think another thing to watch and think about as we wrap up, as these gentlemen who are amazing, I think we can agree, we're talking, I was thinking about like what would be like a cool quote on which to end. And for most of the time, I was thinking it would be this quote from Ronald Reagan about like, if we let freedom die. And one reason I love this quote is he was actually just talking about Medicare. It's this incredibly lofty quote about like taking a last stand for freedom, but he was like, by taking away old people's doctors, which is just the great communicator. But I think our moment calls for something a little different. And so I'm going to quote the fine film Die Hard. After all your posturing, all your speeches, you're nothing more than a common thief. And that came into contention for closing quote, I think, as you're talking about, the golf courses and the golf and the inside dealing and the corruption.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to keep an eye on the corruption, keep an eye on the money. Chris mentioned the difference between sort of some illegal things and just kind of gross things.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of corruption happening. And I would say that the Thursday night massacre is an example of corruption that might not be, covered by corruption statutes, but is nonetheless a form of self-dealing that is worth noting and worth, so there are a bunch of organizations you can follow, such as the Project on Government Oversight, and Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington and others, and you can read the quality media of your choice, talk to the quality professor of your choice. Dare I say, stay woke. And can everyone please thank these fantastic